Welcome everyone. I'm really sorry I can't be here today in Montreal. I wish I could be and having coffee breaks with you, but I'm really happy to be here today. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Bruno, for the invitation and the organization of that symposium on so important matter. And I have the honor to be the chair of that panel, which is climate safety and defense issues. Initially, we had five speakers. One of them could not join us today, so Judith Ox will, in fact, send her apology, but we will have the pleasure of having four passionate in very interesting presentation that will be very varied. So everybody will have 12 minutes to make their presentation.
Try to be on time. I'll tell you when there is 2 minutes left and then when your time is over. So our first speaker will be Dhanasree Jayaram, who is joining us from Manipal. She's assistant professor in the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations in Manipal Academy of Higher Education in India. So it's quite late for her. So thank you very much for taking the time with all these different time slots that we are all over the world. And Dhanasree is going to be presenting a paper on climate security and military strategy implication for the Indian Armed Forces. She's been working on this topic for a few years now, and I'm looking forward to hearing from her. So Dhanasree, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Lucile, and thank you so much for inviting me to this conference. And I apologize for not being able to come to Canada. I think I explained to Bruno how it's like a nightmare to think about traveling at this point in time from one corner to another corner. So, but I'm glad that at least we could have this hybrid mode to ensure that I would be able to present and also hear other presenters. And it's good to see some known faces here. All of I know all these faces, so that also makes me happy to at least meet. Which is, I think, a good thing after a really long time. And as Lucile mentioned, what I'm going to speak about today is about the Indian Armed Forces and the Indian military's engagement with climate-related issues. So the topic the title of my presentation is Climatizing Military Strategy, a case study of the Indian Armed Forces. And I think, Adrienne and Lucile already know about this paper because I happen to write this for a special issue for international politics on climatization and, various aspects of climatization. So what I'm going to focus today is mostly on how the Indian military is sort of integrating climate-related issues or mainstreaming, to some extent, climate-related concerns into their overall strategy, operations, and tactics. So the framework that I have used for my study is, something that most scholars who deal with security studies know about: securitization, riskification, and moving on to something which is more novel in its approach towards security studies, and as well as, in fact, the climate governance broadly as well, about climatization. Now, the idea here is that whatever we deal with today in terms of linking climate change with defense forces largely sort of tends to follow this logic of threat, logic of securitization, which also depends on how climate change is linked with national security. And the Copenhagen School, the Paris School, they've all spoken about how climate change is linked with security through Speech Act or governmental processes, bureaucracy, and other sort of processes that are involved in policy making in general. However, we have also seen that there is a literature, there is enough scope for also linking climate change with the risk logic. So instead of the threat logic, sort of shift towards the risk logic and look at climate-related security risks and different sort of language which helps to understand climate change as a potential risk, something that requires anticipatory defense, something that requires more of a precautionary or preventive approach. Now, from there, what I have sort of looked at is how security or how military strategy in as an extension is climatized. Now, one of the few works, apart from of course Lucile and Stefan have done a lot of work on how climatization occurs in different governance spaces. One of the few works which also deal with military strategy directly is Ol's work, who looks at existing security practices that are applied to the issue of climate change and how new practices from the field of climate policy are introduced into the security field. Now, again, as I mentioned, a lot of this literature is sort of dominated by the Western discourses on climate security. What I'm trying to do is also look at it from the perspective of how it works in some of the developing contexts. Also, we have to keep in mind the Indian Armed Forces, which is like one of the biggest armed forces in the world, and it is heavily deployed in many conflict areas within the South Asian region itself. So, how does the Indian military deal with climate change, and whether there are new practices that are now incorporated into the military strategy on account of the climate related concerns? These are some of the issues that I would be looking at as I progress in my presentation. So as I mentioned, yeah, the usual sort of discourses around climate change and security, as also, not just in the literature that comes out of, scholarly literature, but also if you look at the military-led discourses, you would find expressions of threat multiplier and how climate change exacerbates the existing conflict dynamics. It acts as a trigger point. Or this kind of invocation is very common to also reinforce the threat logic that is associated with climate security. On the other hand, and how that would entail military interventions, which is also something that is part and parcel of how the UN Security Council also tends to look at how climate change is related to conflict through different pathways. Of course, it doesn't have to be linear or direct linkages, but also in terms of correlational linkages, network analysis pathways, and other forms of analysis. The other aspect is about greening defense, which is like an age-old sort of understanding of how the military engages with environmental issues. Something that again arose after the Cold War ended, and how do you use military equipment for greening purposes or environmental purposes. At the same time, you also have this logic of how the military itself needs to transform itself and become more and more climate and environment friendly. The third aspect is about preparedness, and I think this is what concerns most militaries all the time, including when it comes to climate and environmental risks or security risks, as we call it. So preparedness in terms of how climate change will affect their operations or tactics or strategy in the short, medium, and long term. This is something that they constantly work with, and this is something that is also being practiced even in the Indian case, in recent times. Now, how I have framed the typologies for the climatizing moves within the Indian military is to look at it from the perspective of how some of these moves are entirely like symbolic in nature, some of them being more strategic in nature by incorporating it in the military doctrine and other forms of formal and official documents. Some of it is, of course, more precautionary, in nature because of the way, there is, of course, apprehensions over climate change may affect the operations in some places in particular where there is still uncertainty about how climate change really plays out in the conflict regions, especially in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, where there is still a lot of uncertainty around the deployment procedures and other issues. And of course, very few are, go all the way up to transformative approach, which I will be discussing in the upcoming slides. So maybe, just to set the context first as to why, climate change and security and, linking it to military as well becomes a really, really difficult task in the Indian context. And that comes also from the discourses that exist at the policy level, may not be as much at the domestic level. Now, I also have to reiterate that there is a schism that occurs between the domestic level discourses on climate security and how India approaches this issue at the international level. So from this statement from India's representative at the UN in 2019, and of course, recently also when climate change was introduced, and because India is, one of the 12 members now. One of the issues that was in fact raised, of course, apart from the fact that the link between climate change and conflict is still sort of contested, and that we don't need a militarized response to climate change. We can't make military like a primary actor in this entire exercise. It also comes from this notion of how is security perceived in the Indian context as well. So when it comes to understanding of security, which is largely sort of dominated by the ideas of, okay, you have China on one side, you have Pakistan on other side, you have also Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean region. Now this is how threats or security in general is perceived by the military itself. So in a sense, when you link climate change with security, again, the thinking around the issue becomes more in terms of, it becomes straitjacketed into some sort of traditional notions of security itself. Now, this is why there has been reluctance on the part of the Indian policy making to link climate change with security, at least at the international level. Of course, there are other reasons also, which I'm happy to go into if there are questions. So what is this, logic of risk and security logic, threats posed by climate change to the military, as I mentioned, physical impacts on defense installations and infrastructure. Now, one of the issues that are constantly mentioned now today, there are more and more works that are coming up on how, for instance, the disasters or sea level rise or coastal erosion, all these issues are going to affect the naval installations, because we have a huge peninsula where there is a lot of naval infrastructure that is set up. So how is it going to affect all these different infrastructures? The other part is in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region. You can, in the Himalayas, where glacial recession is also something that is being constantly discussed as a potential risk, because already in the Himalayas, with recent border tensions with China as well, the presence of the Indian military has been upped in recent months. Now, what does this mean for deployment procedures when you have glacial recession? Like Siachen Glacier is one example where you have Indian and Pakistani soldiers on both sides of the disputed border. You also have cold, frigid regions in Ladakh as well. Yeah, 2 minutes. And then, of course, there are other risks posed by, say, the maritime disputes in the region. You have threat multiplier. That kind of discourse also exists, for instance, in the joint doctrine of the Indian Armed Forces, where, there is discussion around potentially climate change triggering civil wars, military invasion, migration, and so on and so forth. So if we have to sort of divide these issues into symbolic, precautionary, strategic, and transformative, I think humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, in which the Indian military has been playing a long-standing role, and is sometimes, not sometimes, in fact, many a time they are the first responder when you have a large-scale calamity or large-scale disaster. Now, in such kind of cases, there is, of course, a strategic sort of imperative to integrate the Indian Armed Forces into more and more understanding of how climate change needs to be mainstreamed into planning. Transformatively, yes, India has one of the first ecological battalions of the world, which is the Eco Task Force, which has been engaged in not just ecological restoration activities, but they are also increasingly involved in afforestation programs all across, also contributing to, say, carbon sinks, enhancing carbon sinks, and also contributing to the national goals on climate mitigation itself. There are more and more symbolic moves as well, which also includes, like, green initiatives in conflict-ridden regions like in Jammu and Kashmir and Northeast, where you have insurgencies and terrorism. So you want to also win the hearts and minds of the people. However, there is I would say there are countercurrents as well. Okay, if you can give me 1 minute, I'll just finish it. Yeah. So there are countercurrents to climatization of India's strategy as well, and this also stems from various reasons. As I mentioned, first of all, should the sphere of military action should that be allowed to infiltrate everyday life? That is one of the arguments that during my interviews, particularly these arguments which I came across very often. There is, of course, bureaucratic politics and the strong administrative procedure and bureaucratic controls over the military, which also has an impact on how the military can take any action on its own. However, on a smaller scale, they are able to do that. But long-term strategic sort of imperatives of integrating climate change is something that can happen only if there is that civil-military coordination itself. There are budgetary constraints, and of course, because you have existing territorial disputes and threat to sovereignty and territoriality itself, or territorial integrity, is something that is considered more important than, say, climate security or environmental security. So I'll just come to the conclusion here, and happy to answer more on if there is anything. But basically, the Indian military, as of now, yes, it has put in a lot of measures, including there is a joint doctrine of Indian Armed Forces that I mentioned, which talks about environmental and climate security, how it affects human security, for instance, national security, regional security, increasingly Navy. The Indian Navy in particular is talking about disaster-related impacts in the Indian Ocean region. However, it is still a little far behind in recognizing climate change as critical to their operation, strategy, and survival as compared to some of the other militaries, maybe in the global north. Yes, and neither the civilian establishment nor the military is actually entirely open to this idea of addressing climate change from a security perspective as of now. It also stems from the fact that there is not enough literature or enough knowledge on how climate change can be linked with, say, even like a border dispute with China and Pakistan, except in the case of water sharing. Positions taken by civilian agencies, of course, will have an impact. So there are some subtle shifts in goalposts, and of course, there is some reforms and reforms in the procedures that are being included and incorporated. But as I mentioned, it is mostly in terms of how this will affect military preparedness and effectiveness in the region, rather than something that is more transformative or something that looks at climate change, looks at military as a climate governance actor itself. So thank you so much. Just a couple of articles here, which also gives you an idea of what I work on and how we can look at the issue of military and climate change, that interface, which is still, I feel, a little under-theorized and usually takes only the security perspective.
Thank you very much, Dhanasree, for this very interesting introduction to this panel, because I think it talks to a lot of what the other panelists are going to be talking about. And so now I give the floor to Annica Waleij, who is a senior analyst at the Swedish Defence Research Agency in Sweden. And she's going to be presenting on what is old and what is new, 20 years of defense and environment. She's been working on the topic on, especially in peacekeeping and peace operation in different countries, and how they been included issue around the environment for years. So I think this long-term perspective is going to be really interesting for this panel. Annica, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me here to this very interesting conference. I'm going to skip to the first slide. So the 20 years experience refers to my experience. Defense and environment goes longer back than that. And this slide looks into the early years that was kind of reactive, if you will. Post-Cold War, there were a lot of need to demilitarize old equipment, a lot of legacy pollution, military polluted soils, and in the case of Sweden, we had some issues with dumped munitions in lakes and in the sea, and also in mine shafts, because long time ago the out of sight, out of mind idea prevailed, that if you put something on the ice in the winter and it melts in the spring, then it's gone. But obviously it's not gone, it's still there on the surface and may pollute the environment. And hence there was a need to adapt environmental risk and impact assessment to the military context. And in parallel, not exactly the idea, but in parallel, the environment gained more attention. And I failed to mention that in 1969 already, in the NATO context, the Committee for the Challenge of Modern Society was created. And a lot of various pilot study was carried out, and I looked into the 30 years that they existed before it transitioned into the Security for Peace and Science in NATO. There were two studies, one performed by Canada in the early 2000s that looked into natural hazards and the emerging issue of climate change, and also one already in the mid-90s that looked into climate issues in the Black Sea region. And environmental security became an engagement tool with the former Soviet Union countries, and NATO joined the Environmental Security Initiative and performed some activities there. Also in the mid-90s and later on in the early 2000s, the war in the Balkans and the intervention in Afghanistan, where NATO was present, made their, well, it was obvious that there was a need to address the environmental footprint or bootprint of operations. And during this time, there was a lot of effort looking into base camps and water, energy, waste issues, things that essentially can be engineered away if you have planned for it. The problem was that you hadn't planned for it. So there wasn't a thing that has to be addressed. And a lot of focus during this time was on energy security and energy efficiency. And the next slide will explain a little bit why that is. A lot of military operations is the diesel fuel generators, it's reliable, and you need to have reliable energy supply for the military. But it's really polluting, it's expensive, and as this picture shows, a convoy of fuel transport in Afghanistan. And the US DoD has calculated, on the graph you see fuel consumption and casualties. So actually, it was calculated a casualty factor for delivering fuel, and also for that matter water, into theater. So actually you could measure the fuel cost not only in US dollars, but also in blood, actually. And it was a few newspaper coverage about how these convoys were really a sitting duck for the Taliban. And you see the same trend, actually, we have been talking about the Sahel, in Mali and MINUSMA, where a lot of diesel is transported, and it's really an easy target for insurgents to attack these convoys. And that's really, I find it so annoying, actually, because in Mali, the solar potential is so great there. So why use diesel? But anyway, it's a slow progress in this field. And also this other graph is also US DoD that shows that how much more energy that is consumed these days because of a lot of more advanced technical equipment that will consume more and more energy compared to previous wars. And the courtesy of this slide is actually a Canadian colonel that I've been worked with in various NATO contexts named Lloyd Chubbs. This is a 10-year anniversary of a study we made because we really wanted to find out what are the barriers. It seems obvious that these are low-hanging fruits to address, but what are the barriers? So we did a survey that involved 6 NATO countries, one partner, that is Finland, and both EU, NATO, and UN multinational organizations that deploy troops. And we looked into see, I don't really see it here myself, what it says, but we did interviews and surveys, and what they saw as the principal barriers. And resource constraints is one thing, and that's where one conclusion that we have drawn, that policy might not be so sexy, but if you don't have a policy in place, you will never be able to allocate the human and financial resources to actually do something on the ground. I can just see if I can see on my thing here. Yeah, and also, and this results has been confirmed. There is a Canadian, Stephanie San Miguel. She's done a thesis on, she's been evaluated the whole ISAF operations. She was there as the environmental protection officer for a few rotations. And obviously the military mission is very much focused on security and combat and that kind of things, and not so much on environment. But the thing is that the perception of what environment is and how it actually relates to security there's a lot of work to be done there to make it more make more sense to actually address these issues also. And that's where the mindset come in, to change the mindset and the perception about these issues. And we also then looked at the other side of the coin. So what are the drivers? When does it work? What are the low-hanging sticks, the carrots and the sticks, or low-hanging fruits, sorry. So legal compliance, if somebody can get in trouble for not doing something, that might work. Also, forest health protection, there have been problems. We sometimes say that environment and health is two sides of the same coin. So one example is the burn pits that has been used in Iraq, for instance, where troops burn their waste, but also they inhale the smoke then. And that's very unhealthy, and that's become a huge financial problem for the US Veteran Administration. The security in this survey, it wasn't raised as a very priority issue, but the last thing we did was that ask sort of rhetorically that if you put a more strategic emphasis on this issue, is that the way to go? And 61% in the survey said yes, I mean, that would be good. So essentially, what we want to achieve is less environmental and climate impact of operations. So what are the leverage? Always, military and environment, you always have to leverage something else, because obviously you can say that this is the right thing to do, but that doesn't really fly initially anyway. So focus on how your actions will increase operational efficiency and the strategic end state of the military mission. That is paramount. And also, something that is sort of on the rise is the accountability issue, and a lot of NGOs and others are actually paying a lot of attention to the military taking their responsibility when it comes to climate change and environmental footprint. And for NATO, the 2% goal of every nation contributing 2% of the budget is an issue. So saving money and having return of investment of better equipment, energy saving, I mean, that makes sense also, not only from an environmental or climate perspective. But on the bright side, there is growing political attention, and here there's also leverage to be made between the EU, the UN, and NATO. And already in 2009, during Ban Ki-moon, the idea that UN should move towards climate neutrality was raised, and that include also UN peacekeeping, whose operations actually usually has a much larger footprint climate-wise than the host nation, which is kind of interesting. And another milestone for NATO when it comes to climate change was the strategic concept of 2010 that addressed that climate change and natural resource constraints could have impact on future operations. And this concept is being updated currently and is going to be ready, hopefully, by the summit in 2022. So hopefully there will be a little bit more climate change, actionable climate change action there. Yeah, I can also mention that environment and climate issues are sort of finding its way through strategic documents at the highest NATO level. So not only having an environmental standalone document, but actually being incorporated in other important documents that are planning ahead for the future for NATO. And the climate change, the climate and defense roadmap for the EU is also interesting because most NATO nations actually are EU members also. And most of all of this EU NATO are also UN members. So it makes perfect sense to try to sort of keep track of what other organizations are doing. And at the very highest level, NATO now is planning for implementing the climate change and security agenda into an action plan, which is also going to be interesting to see how they plan to walk the talk and not just having fancy policy documents. So where are we now then? this is obviously a simplification because it was not only reactive before and it's not only proactive now, but the sort of the trend is to go towards more proactiveness, and the bold figures there are what's actually in this climate change and security agenda. That NATO as a security actor should be the leader of understanding the links between climate and security, and also climate action to adapt operations to a changing climate, and also move towards climate neutrality and net zero of its own operations. And there's more emphasis also on foresight, trying to predict what's going to happen, systems thinking, and in EU at least, circular economy is a big thing, which I think also will have some impact. And not least but not less important, also mindfulness towards the receiving nations of our actions, because there are going to be much more support operations for natural disasters and crisis rather than just violent conflict. So understanding how you help without making things worse is also something that is increasing in importance. And I'm not sure where I am time-wise, but
she said 2 minutes, 1 minute ago.
Oh, okay, I missed that, sorry. But this is the last slide, so now I'm trying to do too much things at the same time, I think, sorry. So the way ahead, well, I have been a champion, and I'm not sure it's ever going to happen because of political reasons, but if there were to be a resolution similar to the 1325 on gender at the UN Security Council level, if there was something on environment or climate, that would allocate a lot of resources to actually work with this. So, but the important thing is to walk the talk, to actually operationalize all the nice policy documents and do it in an integrated and holistic approach, because NATO will never only deal with climate change. There are also the hybrid threats, cyber, space, and what have you. So actually looking at it at a holistic level is important. And there are a lot of tools. They just have to be used. And also, I want to raise just the increased demands for transparency. I mentioned NGO pressure and social media and Twitter and what have you. And a lot of NGOs now are keeping track of what the military does, and will hold the military accountable if there are no tangible progress.
Thank you very much, Annica. This was also a very interesting and complementary presentation. And I really liked how you also emphasized about the no harm principle, basically on how we should also think about the receiving countries that benefit from those interventions, and how this is also part of the transparency debate. Je vais maintenant passer la parole à Adrien Estève.
I'm doing postdoctoral research. I'm working in France, in the CNRS in France. Was present her work the risk economy in France and the United States. So we will. Thank you very much, Lucile. I think everybody can hear me as well. I'd also like to thank as well for the organization of these. For this event as well, with the whole team who's worked on the organization, the technical team who's allowed us to have a hybrid conference today. So I'll be speaking in French during my presentation. We're trying to load the presentation now. It's in English anyway, to ensure that everybody can follow my presentation. Is from security risk, en fait, the risks of security in France and the United States. I'll begin by, as we heard, to rerun some of the scientific elements as well. To know that today we heard the last report in 2021. We know the temperature changes, the temperature that we're seeing, and already leading to extreme from security risks, and therefore there have been extreme changes. We've had violent weather patterns and as well, and which has an impact on security. Of course, on the other hand, we realize that international or global emergency we're talking about, we're trying to measure the scope and the extent of these extreme changes. In the Glasgow COP conference, which shows us today, they made there's a gap between the certain angelic approach to the negotiations and actually the real effects of the effects of climate change in the world. And in what's really there's kind of a duality of realities. When the one half here, there's a willing to negotiate, and the other one, this reality is being split. The split in point of view is kind of a schismatic approach. I think we have to look towards more direct solutions to fight against climate change, and that's where military actors can play an important role, a more and more important role as we go in international climate governance, and in prevention as well of climatic risk. More and more that today, the climate security it becomes a dominant paradigm, as we heard, the very title of our conference today. Climate security is used more and more in regional discourse and international discourse. We can talk about the adaptation. We can have the UN environment. We could as well. We think of the IPCC. We think of the UNS and the European Union and NATO as well. As Annica Waleij said, these are strategies which are being written at the very time for NATO, and they will directly have an impact on climate security. Closer to my subject, military leaders for most of the major armed forces in the West are taking this into account, taking climate security into account. There have been declarations in the United States, in the Netherlands, in France. We can also perhaps other European countries as well who are equally affected. Today, we're well beyond the debate, which in terms of compliance, only simple compliance of armed forces to environmental realities. That was the original traditional documentary in terms of only legal compliance. Let me today show how we can measure the emergence of the power of the new climate security paradigm in the case of the military. There are four intertwined trends, in particular, as we already heard a little bit from Dhanasree and Christine as well, and Wojtek as well, and in that publication. We've entered four major trends, which are interrelated, which constitute the new climate security paradigm. The first one comes the environmentalization of the military, securitization of climate change and making climate change more security, climatization of security, and the riskification of climate change. In other words, the risks associated with climate change. Already in terms of the environmentalization of the military, Annie just presented, we just heard from Annie. Today we're continuing to see attempts for greater greening, greater efforts for greening in the military. This began in the 1990s it applied. There were military exemptions at that time. But anyway, the military was exempted from environmental standards and the carbon measures or the carbon footprint. But how much for in official figures? What are the carbon emissions in the Forest Armies? There was a lot of work to find out how much exactly was their carbon footprint. And with the environmentalization, they're trying to highlight more discursive aspects of the process, and if we talk about environmental security, Maertens in 2015, and we will also hear from we'll hear this a little bit later as well. If we talk about the security of the armed forces, securitization, and beginning in the 2010s, the climate was seen as a security issue, particularly by the military forces, military actors. They would focus more and more on the certain numbers of phenomena, the climate crises, the climate extremes. We talked about the consequence of armed conflicts as well, directly related. And we see this discourse on making the securitization of the climate. We're looking at existential security, but we're not so much existential security. We want a preventive. We want to make sure that we talk about prevention of certain phenomena rather than anticipating future crises or future extremes. And in terms of riskification, the risks, we're talking the major headquarters are talking about environmental risks, and these are environmental risks which can be measured. The third phenomena, which is we say that there's the climatization of security today, particularly since COP21. The military authorities have been trying to associate in climate with 300 different security issues. This is particularly the case, as I mentioned, terrorism, particularly terrorism, which has a big impact, and it's also the case of other issues like immigration, migrant peoples, displacement from armed conflict. So this is the climatization of security. It's a reframing of certain issues, which we're drawing a closer parallel with climate changes. We also see this, and this also happens in non-military arena, particularly in the development areas. We're talking more about climate security since 2010, and we're talking, and particularly as an international designation, and particularly within the context of development. My interest, what I really want to talk about, aside from these three phenomena which we just covered, we come with the riskification, an increased risk of climate change, or there's greater and greater risk associated with climate change. And we see the military talking about, they're talking climatic risk and not climatic threat. It's a change, it's very important. Climatic risk, not climatic threat. And why? Because if we talk about the risk, climatic risk, it means that we can manage climatic insecurity, we can manage climatic crises in a logical, rational way. We can calculate, we can measure, we can assess what exactly the extent of the risk is. As we saw in Beck in 1997, and since that time they've been increased, we talk about risks. If we talk about climate risk, we create a demand. There becomes a demand for security, and the demand will allow us to measure what are the extent or the. We talk about climate risk. If we can associate climate risk with security issues, there's a greater and greater demand. And so the demand for security becomes great, and the armed forces will present themselves a legitimate institution to prevent such risks, to measure the risks, and to manage the risks. So they will have a legitimate role to play. And there's two studies, the French Army and the American Army did a study. For the French Army, what they did, the riskification led to reformulate three issues in terms of climatic and create the greater request for security in relation to these three issues: natural catastrophes, immigration, and armed conflict. For natural, we say, contrary to the traditional idea that we have to manage over a long time, the Army talks about, when we talk about climate risk, we have to act now, starting today, to anticipate and manage climate risk, which it means we need immediate solutions, we need strong solutions to really, really counter these risks. The second element of the migrant peoples, if we talk about climate risks, against the idea of the definement of unidimensional climate change, this will allow us to manage very locally, very specifically, the flows of migrant peoples to anticipate the explosion of further migration in future years. It's a preventive policy. We can develop short-term security policies. And in terms of armed conflicts, against the idea, the changement that we can manage climate change multilaterally, but the armed forces talk about international chaos, and the armed forces will intervene to give us greater order in our relationship to terrorism and in international relations. In all three dimensions, prevention. The Army will be a force to reduce risk, and even to eliminate risk. That's something which is extremely, extremely credible. For the United States, particularly the Trump, I studied him in my thesis, during my thesis. There were three phenomena associated with the security risks, which we talked about. The extreme weather events, natural catastrophes, was the first of all. We said that in terms of resilience under the Trump administration, they want to prevent on American territory the most deleterious effects of climate change. In terms of the second risk is the hostile living conditions, which are more and more hostile, and this both within America. There's a willing to adapt certain regions which are affected by desertification and drought, to adapt these regions for any future climate catastrophes, and the Army, the National Guard will be involved in that to manage these. And we talk about armed tensions. It's another tension. And in the case of the French doctrine, the very same, to anticipate the chaos, prevent the chaos, and the most chaotic effects of climate change. We talk about resilience in the United States under Trump, because they nationalized climate change. It was nationalized in both France and in the United States. We're talking about the political level. France, the vision. We talked about risk, climatic risk. It supports on the colonial vision, which, as we were saying this morning, in the Sahel, the years after the decolonization, in the United States under Trump, the making security political, it was under the America First. That was part of we want to manage these crises within our own. And Biden, there's another change. There's perhaps openness, not just in the United States, but I'd like to conclude. And let me conclude to add in my analysis knowledge and productive knowledge on the essential elements of the increasing risk of climate change. Military forces need experts, they need the expertise, they need research centers who can assess such risks, they can quantify the risk, and can make it operational for the armed forces. We can see emerge there's the knowledge, the Canadian for Climate Security in the United States, the Observatory for Defense and Climate in France, which was created by the Minister of the Armed Forces. We also, another fact that we have to think about in current academic research on climate security, we're confronted with this new knowledge, which is operational knowledge, practical knowledge, to ensure a greater increasing security. And finally, I'd like to identify four solutions, possible solutions to move forward for research, a new research agenda, in eventual cooperation work. The first approach would be to identify different approaches to climate security, national, human, ecological. At heart, she's not here today, but then we can do it. We can think of climate security from a national point of view, human dimension, and the ecological dimension as well. The second element, we have to interest more and more. We think about climate security in the Anthropocene. And we're talking about the more ecological understanding of security. As Harrington said, rather than adaptation, we have to have mitigation and prevent the most deleterious effects of climate change, rather than adopting continually emergency measures. The third would be the emerging climate security practices and institutions. How do we talk about climate security? I'm working particularly with the NATO, but also for the African Union as well, as also have to look at that. And we'll have to look at new mechanisms for cooperation and partnership finding. And lastly, there's the colonial aspects of climate security and the regionalization of the phenomenon. In France, we're talking about the Sahel, in Southeast Asia, and other countries. In the former colonial powers, talked about other geographical areas which were involved. And where we look in particular for, we see very clearly, we're not talking so much about climatic resilience. In Europe, in the United States, we know we're always saying about the climate crisis will happen in other countries which are not prepared and which are not adequately prepared. So that we have the responsibility of taking charge. Thank you very much. And I'll be glad to answer any of your questions. Adrian, thank you very much for that presentation, very clear. For your research is of course very interesting. And it really contributes a lot to that. For the Observatory for Security, she will present in the Arctic, I think she said, the acceleration of the permafrost. The melting of the permafrost has been accelerated, and we've seen other regions of the world as well be discussion on the link between security efforts and climate changes.
Yes, I'm here, so we will actually deal with colder zones. So I'm a researcher linked to the OBSA, the SIAC in France, and I'm working on the subpolar region since 2012, and I went in the field where I tried to personalize the concept of human security, applying it to specific case studies. And applying one dimension to specific cases, a relationship between Inuit and military in the Canadian Arctic, sanitary safety, climate change accelerations of permafrost melting that we will discuss today. And also, before I had to introduce to you my geographical zone to exemplify the complexity of what I'm talking today. So first of all, two maps. Does it work? Yes. Yes, Arctic is being described as a uniform zone like Antarctic. But as you all know, Arctic is the region which is situated around the North Pole in the Arctic Ocean, and it's not a continent, it's a notion which is surrounded by two continents, sovereign state, having their own history, their population, there is as many Arctics as you have Arctic region, and even in the Arctic you have several sub-regions. Canadian Arctic is not the Groenland Arctic, and the Nunavik in Quebec is very different from the Nunavik, which is territory independent of Canada. It's very difficult to generalize over that zone. I'll try to show all the complexity by using concrete examples. But also, in that zone, there is 8 states which are considered as being Arctic states, and you have sub-regions that could be delimited according to 3 criteria. Either they are situated in the north of the Arctic Circle, in north on the map, or it could be the region that would have an average temperature of less than 10 degrees during the highest month, which is the red line on the map. It could also be the region north of the tree zone, that is the taiga, the difference between taiga and the tundra, which is in green on the map. So the last 2 ones are linked to climate change. The trees are actually more and more going north onto tundra, and the impact of the 10-degree isotherm will take a more example in the Saryako-Chakin Republic in Russia, well, I will bring you later on. They registered a temperature record of 48 degrees in 2021. That's much above the 10-degree limit, so the frontier of these Arctic subregion are moving. And I talk about 8 states which are considered as being Arctic states. If you have restrictive list, you have the United States, Canada, Greenland, the Norway, of Russian Federation, and you can add Finland, Sweden, and Iceland. That's for the geographical setup. I will not talk about the actually the permafrost, where it is situated and where it is, how it is manifesting. Permafrost in English, that's the probably a term that you know. It's ground where the temperature is equal or under 0 degree for 2 consecutive years. In Arctic, you have 3 layers. The active one on surface that will freeze and thaw according to this. So you have the permafrost strictus and so, which is submitted to seasonal fluctuation but remain under the freezing point. And you have the basis, which is not submitted to season fluctuation. It's 20% of the Earth's surface and north of 60th degree north, like you can see on the map. Sorry. Permafrost is, in fact, encompass a great part of the Russian, Canadian, and Alaskan surface, but it's only it represents only part of Groenland, and naturally it under different depth, and as the following map will show, the Arctic subregions are not inhabited. There is 4 million people which have a very unequal distribution because half of them live in Russia. 70% of Arctic infrastructure are based on permafrost. The impact of this melting represent a challenge for all the Arctic states, and I will show you a precise example. 4 examples that I've selected, and we will begin by Alaska. In Alaska, you have a minority of the population that lives on permafrost zone, but most of the territory, most of the land is has if you want sea shore permafrost, and the American defense will underline the risk link on the existing infrastructure and the possible new infrastructure. To this day, we have 9 bases, which are situated in Alaska, and we have 3 bases by service, armed service. And when you do cross these bases with the permafrost map, you can notice that 6 of these 9 bases are situated on northern permafrost or a shore permafrost, coastal permafrost. These 3 bases are that of the Coast Guard. They're situated south of permafrost zone, and the 3 most important bases in Alaska, which have an average of 6,000 militaries, are situated on interior permafrost or at the border with the zone of coastal permafrost. And let's take now the Canadian example with the Tuktoyaktuk Road, which is the first road that all-weather road that was built in Canada. It's a $300 million project that began in 2014, 138 kilometers linking Tuktoyaktuk to Inuvik, and it was a challenge to build because of the permafrost, which in fact is a challenge during the melting period. The work began during the winter period, and thousands of workers worked during with temperature varying from -4 to -60 degrees. They had to build 8 bridges that have a time span of or an expected lifespan of 75 years, and there will be $1.7 million for these 137 kilometers inaugurated in November 2000. It was closed in May 2018 because of the permafrost melting. It's not because in the facilities were too old. It was open just because of the Groenland, and naturally I will bring you to the airport in Garuswak, which is the transit airport for Groenland. Even for the capital city, which is south of Garuswak, you have to fly through that airport in 2019. I won't take those of 2020. You had 11,000 flights. The climate change made that airport such that it will be close to civil flight before 2024, 2025, and the airstrip were damaged, and the financial risk is much too important. And this is the civil flight because the Danish Ministry of Defense had an agreement with the Greenland government to use these airstrip over 2024. So for the Danish Defense Ministry, this is a fundamental for this present and for the activity of safety and rescue is the Danish Ministry of Defense that is in charge of the sea rescue. I will bring you on a terrain that I know better because it was the object of my previous research. Let's go in Russia. 75% of the land is situated on the Permafrost zone. In 2021, the Russian Ministry of Research said that 40% of Russian infrastructure will be actually affected by this permafrost melting. So that's the work that I did in the field because on the what I did at the Yakutsk University in the Saratoga Republic that I mentioned previously in red on this map. More specifically, with my colleague from the Sea Arc, we went in the region of Bolinsky. I'm trying to stay inside my 12 minutes. I only have 2 minutes remaining, which is the northern part of the Yakutsk Republic during the maritime border in 2009. The idea was to document the inhabitant approach of this acceleration of the permafrost melting. A few pictures taken in the field. Semikitsisi has 4,000 inhabitants in 2018. You have major building. It's situated on the continent. It's not much coastal erosion. It's the administrative capital of the Blusky region, and near Tiski you have a military base. It's a military airport that will allow for naturally to fly to that city. In 2012, 2000, already the airstrip were damaged and the military base was closed during all that period. The city and its inhabitants were supplied by helicopter. It is more expensive and you cannot carry as many material. I have no more time, but you can see on the picture that all the pipings are out of the ground, and the building are built on pillar to minimize the melting of the ground because of heating in Bykovsky. It's a village of 526 people situated on the peninsula, and there is a strong coastal erosion because this village will disappear in the next 50 years. There's a very strong coastal erosion, and these two examples, in fact, are not very far one from the other, and they're perfect to illustrate the challenges of a region and not very far one from the others. So I try to show to you what is the impact of permafrost melting, and I had no time to talk about the solutions that are not really viable solution to fight against this acceleration, and nor the other consequence like the release of pathogenic agent or methane that will have an impact on this region. I will stop there because of the lack of time, and the word will be done to Licia. Thank you, Magli, for this presentation. It was very clear, well illustrated, and will bring us on other field which illustrate this transversal issue that we've seen in all the presentation, the materiality and the temporality of all these issues. And I will now open the question period. If you are online, you can put your question. In fact, you can raise your hand electronically, then they will be given to the different presenters. Since I cannot see the room, I will invite my colleague in Montreal to signal to me if there is any question from the room, and I'll give them the mic.
Est-ce qu'on a déjà des questions dans la salle en attendant peut-être ça se formule en ligne?
Is this on? Magali, thank you. Thank you, all of you, for your excellent presentations and joining us online as well. A really fascinating panel that went all over the world and super informative. I'm Blair Bermel. I work for Global Affairs Canada on climate change and security policy. And Magali, I thought it was a shame that you got cut off at the end because I was fascinated by the direction you were going in. And I wanted to ask on the solutions end of what's happening in terms of the response to all this permafrost damage. You know, clearly from your presentation, it's a civilian issue and it's a military issue. So from what you've seen, where are the solutions and the responses coming from? Is it, I mean, clearly it's probably both sides. Is it weighted more heavily one side or the other? And is there good exchange already between kind of civilian and military actors where maybe military solutions are being applied to civilian problems or vice versa? I wonder if you could talk a little about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. We could take several ones if there is other in the room, otherwise I just give the floor to Magali. Okay, I do have now a question in the chat, so let me read it. It's from John Sears asking, in the Arctic, are there Inuits' indigenous approaches to the interface of climate and conflict resolution that inform the conversation ongoing? So this question goes to Magali. Maybe Magali, you can have a first start after answering both questions.
Yeah, sure. Is it okay if I speak in French? I can do both, but it would be faster in French, I guess. Well, now I switch my brain in English, so okay. Pour répondre à votre...
To answer to your question, from a military standpoint, when I mentioned the Arctic strategy of the American Defense Department, we only begin to talk about the permafrost melting, and the only answer that you have for the Arctic was that they needed some more research. So, well, this is it. When you're facing coastal erosion or building crumbling, there is only two choices. Either you delocalize, that is, you send your population elsewhere, or you're closing. For the relocalization, I mentioned because Kiwi people don't have the means to be relocalized. They would say to me that, well, anyway, in 50 years, one half of us will be dead and the other half will have moved because, in fact, there will be no more fish and we won't be able to hunt or to fish. And actually in Alaska you had the Shishnarev community, which very illustrative of the different problems. And Shishmarek is 600 inhabitants and it's a very small community. And there is a study that estimated at $119 million to move these community. In general, they study military bases like the one in Alaska that I mentioned. I can imagine that they will rather go for the closure, and the same thing for the airports. Well, in fact, it's too expensive for civil infrastructure in terms of technology or the return to experience. We will have to wait from Department of Trade. There is a technique called the thermal siphon, which is used in the Yana Peninsula for routing hydrocarbons, which are little tube that will keep the temperature of the ground below zero. So it will be, you can imagine the price if they had to do that in all polar infrastructure. There was also another study in Canada, it was used in Canada for the Alaska Road. I don't have the figures in mind, but a study was published by the Ottawa Transportation Ministry, and it's on the Alaska Road, they made a comparison on the portion built on permafrost and those that weren't. And you have a ratio, the ratio is 5 times higher to maintain a road built on permafrost than to maintain a road which is built on non-permafrost zone. And we're talking about 20,000 Canadian dollars per year. And to maintain these road strip built on permafrost. So these are reflection hints that I can give you. So research, relocalize or close. Quite interestingly, 40% of the Russian hydrocarbon extraction sites are built on permafrost zones. So you have to do some kind of computation when $20,000 for a small road in Canada. So the cost, you can imagine the cost for the hydrocarbon sectors in Russia. For the Inuit approach, I have not actually hear about what they have said. I can only give you info solution, but these are not proven scientific results. I can tell you that people do not have the means to reduce their carbon impact in the Canadian Arctic zones, since they are being heated by fuel. There is no other way but to use fuel to have electricity or to heat themselves. So they have no other solution. So what their approach for the concept of human safety in that research that I made in Russia will tell you that it depends on people. Some will tell you it is quite coarse as a summary, but we cannot do anything. People cannot do it. So why would they be depressed because of that? Then you have in Shishmaret, they want to be relocalized, but I do believe that part of that population, the Aboriginal population, doesn't have the financial means to do something. Well, maybe that because of the situation, they feel that they cannot do anything at all. I don't know if I answered your question or not. Thank you, Magali. Maybe that the person that asked a question will come back on it. I have another question from Philippe de Vion, intended to Adrien, the Chinese government and the PLA. Do they have a standpoint on climate safety, and maybe that this is something on what you worked on with Judith, or if there is any question from the room? Yes, there is some, yes. Does it work? Yes. Thank you, everybody.
Daniel, I have a general question for my colleagues. We talked in the previous panel about the temporal challenge or problem, however you want to put it, that the future is used as empirical evidence. There's a lot of speculation in many ways. And Adrien also spoke or mentioned the aspect of conflict prevention beyond all our talk about the climate security. So I'm wondering, I guess, in your work, how do you see that sort of temporal, or is there any sort of temporal or intellectual shift in thinking about the temporality of climate change? What I mean by this is, within military institutions, do we plan or do we look into operation in different temporal terms, or is just planning as usual, planning for scenarios in the future wars with China, whatnot, you know, the sort of general military planning that the military has always been doing, or is that temporality that we attach to climate change as being somewhat different, or or a challenge, like I was saying, is that somehow inserted into everything you've said, or is there such a thing as a temporal challenge for military institution when it comes to strategic thinking and operational planning and so on and so forth, if this makes sense?
Thank you, Bruno, because we're connected across the ocean, because I have this question about temporality, but I would like to add the methodology. How will this different temporality issue be studied by the actors working on these issues? Adrien, would you like to answer, begin to answer at least? No problem. Yes, for the first question online about China. I'm not a China expert, far from that, especially if they're using the term of risk in their strategic thinking. What I can say about China is that they have a very technical vision of climate issues, and it's a belief in geoengineering to resolve some of the problems due to climate change. These elements are known, it's been translated in English. A lot of work has been done on the zero carbon Chinese strategy. Well, they will be based on climate engineering, and the military knowledge are invested in that. Like in the United States, the army is very present in the field of geoengineering, and they do increase the knowledge on climate engineering. As for the risk aspect, in fact, in logic of regionalization, is there any work on the climate risk over the South China Sea? My hypothesis will be that yes, there is some, especially what I've seen in France or the United States, for the Chinese case. Each country will apply, in fact, studies to their backyard, geographically speaking. So actually, I'm simply spreading the French and American hypothesis to China. As for the temporality question for the risk, in fact, we are in an emergency temporality. I'm under the impression that the emergency is more and more present in terms of temporality and military reflection. It was a surprise for me because at the beginning of my research, the climate change will be taken to a long temporality. That is, we would have work over 25 or 30 years where the army would have time to examine. It's one of the very few institutions that has time to do prospective work, but they're interested by the short term, very short term, 1 year or two. What will we have in terms of climate risk, immigration, terrorism, because of climate risk? I was very sad, in fact, not to see any work done for the long run, which has been the object of some think tank reflection, but not from the part of military commanders. It's really, they're focusing on short terms. And one more time, there is a sense of emergency. Those who are working for the headquarters, the general staff, let's say, are, how should I say, they also have that immediate crisis. Yes, they are also focusing on the short term, and like we are trying to do that with different discussions. Yes. Well, thank you. It allowed us to increase the subjectivity behind the temporality of the issue. And Rashid, you want to be
on the question of temporality that was addressed to everyone? I don't know. Yeah.
Are you asking me? I'm sorry, I missed. Yeah. Is this the question about China? So I'm because of the translation, I'm a little lost, but I suppose the question is about China and PLA, right?
So there was a question about China and PLA that was addressed to Adrien, but if you do have input on that, that would be very useful. But also Bruno has a question to everyone about the temporal challenges and how, in your case, like Indian forces see the temporality of the climate security and climate crisis.
So about China and PLA first, again, there is no stated policy of China on climate and security. The PLA, of course, doesn't have as such. But increasingly, what you're seeing at the international level is that China is acknowledging climate security at the UN Security Council, not as much as some of the other countries, say in Europe, but then, or the least developed countries or island countries, but still there is more acknowledgement there. This comes, I mean, also with respect to, China's position in the international climate order itself. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that China wants to project itself as a climate responsible power, a climate superpower that wants to sort of position itself as a country that is very serious about dealing with climate change. At the same time, as Adrian mentioned, I think there is also that regional component attached to it, because China has Tibetan Plateau, and which is the origin of major rivers that flow down to South Asia, Southeast Asia. So I think on especially water-related concerns, there are some security elements which are slowly getting integrated into Chinese climate strategy as well, because these rivers are also integral to China's own adaptation measures, and also how to deal with, say, the desertification that is happening in the north of China. So these rivers are going to resolve some of these problems as far as China is concerned. Now, to come to temporality and institutional changes, I think this is very important to discuss. And as Adrian mentioned, again, a lot of emphasis tends to get laid on the short-term measures. And this, I would like to reiterate, this also comes from the fact that the civilian agencies themselves in a country like India, where development imperatives are still very important, and security is, or long-term sort of planning is contingent on where development takes the country to, right? So when you have developmental concerns dominating the climate change discourse, what also we have to keep in mind that institutions dealing with climate change are, having that perspective in mind. So it's like the layering of institutions, right? So climate change is kind of layered over various institutions, and there's not much of institutionalization that has happened even among the civilian agencies. So to expect that the military would then, become like a primary actor is something, I think it will take a really long time. I think it's way away. So I think in terms of the temporality part, it has to start from the civilian agencies, including like Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, which are all engaged in planning in some way or the other. But in terms of the military, the Ministry of Defence, the integrated headquarters of the three forces of the military, all these different agencies are slowly looking at scenarios. But then I feel it's still very early stages to talk about this. I think still the focus is more on, say, how how the melting Siachen glacier will affect the deployment of Indian soldiers, in that place, or how the rising temperatures in Ladakh is going to affect the deployment of Indian soldiers who are who are protecting the borders, Chinese incursions, for instance. So usually it's just at the level of short-term thinking, and hasn't gone to that extent of long-term thinking.
Thank you very much, Dhanasree, for those two answers in one. Now, Annica, would you like to jump in on the temporality question?
Yes, actually, and from a Swedish perspective, because that is what I know best, obviously there's a lot of here and now and short term, but also the defense, Swedish armed forces and the defense sector that supports the armed forces aren't exempt from the goal of becoming climate neutral in 2045. So the assumption is that the defense sector should transition to climate neutrality at the same pace as the rest of the society, which is kind of tricky and creates a lot of headache, because if you invest in a material system, it's not like buying a new iPhone or an electric bike. The lifespan of military advanced equipment is very long. So what we invest in now, we will be stuck with for a long time. And that's a huge challenge. But it also is a challenge about security of supply, because if we were to have exceptions that we don't need to do certain things, How do we assure that we get the supply of, for instance, fossil fuel that we need if the rest of the society has transitioned towards climate neutrality? So it is short-term thinking, obviously, but also a lot of work going on presently within the defense sector, and there's a special group created on climate change adaptation to figure out how we are supposed to reach this goal in 2045. So, and I assume that a similar work is going on in other European countries as well, because everybody that's part of European Union is working towards this goal.
Thank you very much, Annica. I think we need to conclude the session. I don't know, we started with a couple of minutes late, so can I still give the floor to Magali to conclude? There was also a specification in the chat about the question on indigenous knowledge, saying that the Inuit Circumpolar Council had to, in the position paper in the COP26, said that indigenous knowledge and leadership should be valued in climate action and support indigenous participation in climate governance. So that was just to follow up on that. But Magali, would you like to conclude on temporality?
I have not much element on that. All I've seen with my work with the Canadian Rangers, which are Aboriginal reservists, I worked with Inuit reservists, working with the CAF. They are impacted by climate change during their patrol, their exercise. Before they have a winter training period that was winter with the more uncertain climate, they have to review this exercise planning. So that's very short term. And we will see how the thaw period will affect all that, but that's really the only impact of a direct impact. Examples I could give to the panel. Thank you, Magali. Thank you to all the participants for your questions. Have a good hand of conference. I was quite pleased to chair and preside this panel. So eat well in Montreal. It's lunchtime.